with bipolar disorder, but I think some of you might have even more than that. So I'll be very interested to hear your perspectives on what I'm talking about. So that'll be really great. So yes, thank you for that introduction. My name's Andrea. I'm a doctor of psychology. I'm a postdoc in therapy. I specialize in treating bipolar disorder. So I've turned my own mess into what I hope is my message and giving back to my community. I've created a self-stigma program that's being used kind of all over the world. It's pretty cool. But again, above all, I have lived with bipolar for 25 years, and that is my primary credential here. So today we're going to do a quick dive into self-stigma. This may be of interest to you if a couple of things. If you feel embarrassed about having bipolar, I encounter so many people who feel embarrassed about this diagnosis. I encounter so many people who carry a sense of shame about themselves due to the diagnosis. If you're having any low self-esteem, these things might all be coming from self-stigma in your bipolar disorder. So before I even get to self-stigma, what is stigma? This is like a super buzzword we hear all the time these days, right? It's academically, its first definition was an attribute that is deeply discrediting, right? An attribute that's deeply discrediting. So stigma can be understood as the negative beliefs held about a certain group due to a difference in those people. For example, I have red hair. There's the example stigma that redheads or gingers, as you would call them in the UK, have bad tempers. I can neither confirm nor deny. But this is a stigma. I use this as a joke because it's kind of lighthearted. But stigma is, in fact, inherently negative, right? So again, I joke about redheads, but think about the stigmas that you do hear that are more serious and more detrimental about mental health, about other identities, racial identities, ethnic identities, religious identities, gender identities. I don't really want to give those any airtime, but if you think about the negative beliefs you hear about certain groups of people who are different, those are stigmas. So stigmas surrounding bipolar disorder, okay, what have we heard? Some really common ones that I've heard, that I hear a lot. People with bipolar are unreliable. They're dangerous. They're overly emotional. They can't live productive, meaningful lives. And like as I'm saying these, they probably sound ridiculous, but take a moment to reflect if you've ever been directly or indirectly fed these messages. And consider how they have now, or even in the past, made you feel about yourself. And if it seems you have a really great community here in the Rotary eClub, think about other people you know and their experience of this as well. So all of that brings us to self-stigma. So stigma are the negative beliefs we hold about a group of people who are different. Self-stigma are the negative beliefs we hold about ourselves because we are somehow different. In this case, we're different because we have bipolar, right? So the negative beliefs we hold about ourselves due to having bipolar. And there is a negative value judgment created in self-stigma. Counterexample, there's a stereotype, which is different from a stigma. There's a stereotype that people with bipolar disorder are more creative. There is actually some decent research backing this up. That's not a stigma because it's not a bad thing, right? Saying someone with bipolar disorder is dangerous or unreliable, that's a stigma, it's a bad thing. So if someone with bipolar is feeling that they're dangerous or unreliable, that's self-stigma. Those are the negative beliefs I hold about myself because I have bipolar, just because of that. So how did we get here? How did we get from negative beliefs we hold about other people to negative beliefs we hold about ourselves? Well, there's two ways. The first way is the internalization process. So we hear these stigmas, not just hear them, but absorb them in the media. Think about how many times you turn on the television, you see a character who has bipolar, who's really kind of off the rails. They're not doing anything responsible. They're making a mess of everything. That's a message that you're taking in about what it's like to have bipolar, right? So we absorb these messages from the public, from other people's opinions, from the media, what other people say. We absorb them and we start to agree with them. We start to think, wow, okay, that must be me. I have bipolar. Maybe I'm like that too. It's kind of like toxic fumes, right? You don't even realize you're breathing them in, but you are. and they're doing some damage. So we're aware of these public stigmas. We tend to agree with them and apply them to ourselves. And then we get this sort of degradation of our sense of self as we incorporate these negative beliefs into our own sense of self. That's the first way, is the internalization progress, being aware and applying it to ourselves. The second way is the distortion process. That's twice now. The distortion process. And that is when you actually have a negative experience due to bipolar. And let's be honest, there are lots of those. So you have a negative experience and you distort its importance. You distort its overall meaning in your life. You reappraise it in a way that's not accurate. And then you end up feeling bad about yourself. Let me demonstrate this with an example. I used to be a teacher. I really struggled to be a teacher, partly because I could not be someplace at 7 o'clock in the morning with bipolar. That was not in my capacity to do that. And so I had to quit this career. I had to totally walk away from this career I had trained for. That was a real struggle, right? That was kind of devastating. But I started to believe about myself that I was just useless in the workplace, right? Across the board, couldn't be of use in the workplace, had nothing to contribute to the world. But it turns out now I actually have a meaningful career. I wasn't useless in the workplace. I had just taken my one experience of struggling in the workplace and blown it out of proportion to say I'm useless in the workplace. That negative belief about myself, I'm useless in the workplace because of my bipolar, that's a self-stigmatizing belief. I had distorted my real experience into something really negative and kind of all-encompassing, right? Another example that I hear a lot from people is that they'll never amount to anything. I'll never amount to anything because of my bipolar. This again is distorted. It's probably true you had some struggles in any one area of life, but it's certainly not true that someone will never amount to anything, right? So when we get this distortion process, I really ask people to hold themselves in compassion for the struggles they've had and not to let them take over and kind of get blown out of proportion. I want to just show you a quick slide on that. Share. I've only got a couple of slides, don't worry. Not academic. So we've got these two processes of how self-stigma forms. The internalization of public stigma, where we become aware, turn it on ourselves, and incorporate it into our beliefs. And we've got the second, the distortion, where we have very real struggles, but we distort and exaggerate them, overemphasize their importance, and then incorporate them into our core beliefs about ourselves. So those are the two ways. So now you've got a really good background on what self-stigma is and where it comes from. That said, what's it matter? Why am I rambling on about self-stigma? Well, there's a lot of negative outcomes that can come from self-stigma. So many. Research has shown a lot of these. Low self-esteem, someone feeling flawed, defective, I'm not good enough, this pervasive sense of shame, lower quality of life, worse functioning, worse depressive symptoms. So in a condition where depressive symptoms are part of the problem, part of the manifestation of the condition, if you feel bad about the condition, you actually have worse symptoms of the condition. Like that's a terrible loop to be caught in, right? People who are experiencing self-stigma are less likely to seek help. They have worse mental and physical health because they're less likely to seek help at all. They withdraw socially. They have poorer coping skills. They have a less sense of well-being, and they even have increased suicidal ideation. So this is really, in the community as a whole, is really a very serious problem. I want to show you one more slide for this. Just a little infographic to remind you some of the really detrimental outcomes of self-stigma. So some real life manifestations of these outcomes, people not getting help. That's a really big one. I've seen individuals who've taken my group program, people who have episodes, and instead of explaining at their job what happened so they can get the help they need, they just quit their job and get a new job. I've seen this happen. I've also seen people hiding their diagnosis from their family because they're too ashamed but then they don't get the support they need from their family, right? And even one step further, people being so ashamed of their symptoms that they don't get the help they need from a professional. So if you don't get treatment, you continue to suffer. So here we are again in this loop where self-stigma is actually making the condition that much worse, giving you more symptoms and preventing you from getting the help that you need and deserve. Just a word about shame, right? Excuse me. Shame is not the same as guilt, right? Probably all aware of this. Guilt is feeling bad for something you've done, and it helps you learn and change your behavior. So let's say I cheat on a test at school, and I feel bad about that, so I decide not to cheat on any more tests. That's guilt. That's adaptive. That's helpful, right? How I feel about something in the past has informed what I do in the future. Shame, which you see a lot in self-stigma, involves a value judgment on the core of who you are. It's unpleasant. It's damaging. Guilt is I feel bad. Shame is I am bad. And we really want to tackle shame as much as possible. And one way to do that is by tackling self-stigma. Okay, so that's the background. So what can we then do about shame and self-stigma? Like I said, having bipolar, I think you'll probably agree, is already hard enough. Do we really need to make it more difficult by adding shame and self-stigma and embarrassment and all those feelings of self-loathing to the mix? I say no. So I created this program to address self-stigma, specifically in bipolar. I'll give you the website later. And I'm actually turning it into a workbook. But don't worry, this is not a book pitch because the book is not written yet. It's not due out until 2026. But in the future, it will be a workbook people can take home and work through these feelings on their own. But what can we do about it now? I want to walk you through a few techniques. One of the first things I always talk about with people is language. Now, as a side note, I fully respect, I'm not here to police language. How people talk about their experiences and their condition is 100% their choice, and I respect that. I encourage people to examine the language choice between I am bipolar and I have bipolar. And this is such a simple thing that people can do. A lot of people will default to saying I am bipolar. However, you would not say I am cancer. You would not say I am broken leg or I am arthritis. No, you would say I have those things. This is what we call person first language because it puts the person first. Bipolar is not you, it's just something you have. And if you change how you talk about it, you change the wording, it takes the power away from the condition and it focuses on who you are, which can be a really powerful change. Again, I have met people who prefer to say I am bipolar, and that's fine, but this choice should be made with intention, right? The language you use impacts how you think, which impacts how you feel. So it's really quite powerful. So think about that, the language that you choose to use. The second thing we can do is to challenge and reframe some of these thoughts we're having, right? So if you've ever been through any sort of CBT type therapy, feelings interplay with thoughts, right? Feelings come from thoughts and appraisals of the world. So how we appraise the world, how we interpret the world will determine our feelings about a situation. So if you're experiencing feelings of shame, I'd say examine your thoughts. What are you thinking right now that is driving those feelings of shame? So if you're feeling bad about yourself particularly, you may be having a self-stigmatizing thought. So let's identify it. And once we identify it, we can look for some thought errors. So let's look first at some example self-stigmatizing thoughts. Like we said, I'm unreliable. I can't handle anything. I'm difficult to love. I will never get better. These are ones that I've heard over and over again from participants, from clients, right? So looking at those, we can look for some thought errors, right? So some thought errors, one example is what we call catastrophizing. That's making the biggest, worst presumption possible out of one situation. So for example, if I say, because I have bipolar, no one will ever love me and I'm going to die alone. That's catastrophizing. We've gone from I have bipolar to no one will love me to I'm going to die alone. That's going straight to the worst situation possible, right? That's a thought error. That's not true. And it's definitely not helpful to think that way. Another thought error that people can be on the lookout for is mind reading, which is thinking that you know what other people are thinking. So if you say, everyone thinks I'm a burden, That's mind reading. That's the thought error of mind reading, because you don't know what other people are thinking. Maybe some people think you're a burden. Maybe some people don't. Maybe some people don't have an opinion, right? But you are mind reading, and that thought error is probably making you feel bad. Two more thought errors. Fortune telling, which is when you think you know the future. If anybody here can actually tell the future, please message me offline. I have some serious questions for you. But saying things like, I won't ever get any better, that's fortune telling. You don't know what the future holds, right? You might have reason to think you'll struggle again, but that's not the same as saying I won't get better. And if you're thinking, I'm never going to get better, I'm never going to get better, you're going to feel terrible about yourself and your life. The last thought error that I'll cover is black and white thinking, which is just what it sounds like, seeing things without the shades of gray, saying things like, I can never be counted on. Okay, maybe you had some situations where you weren't able to fulfill a commitment because of your bipolar, but exaggerating that into black and white thinking and saying, I can never be counted on, that's, again, not true, and it's not helpful, and it's going to make you feel bad. So having this awareness of whether or not your thoughts are true, accurate, helpful, can be very helpful in dismantling self-stigma and shame. Are you focusing too much on one bad experience and negating the positive? Are you overgeneralizing? These are all things to look at. So once we've got these thoughts and we can see the thought error, we can reframe them, because again, what you think is going to impact how you feel about yourself. When we reframe thoughts, we want to look at being more true and more helpful. We want to be less judgmental and more self-compassionate. And we really want to account for nuance in experiences. This is one of the most powerful things you can do, I think, in life in general, but definitely in bipolar, is to see the nuance in experiences. Remember when I said I'm useless in the workplace because I can't be a teacher? I did not see the nuance in that experience, and I felt terrible as a result, right? Now I see the nuance. I can say teaching was not a good fit for me, but being a therapist is a good fit for me. I'm not useless in the workplace. So again, how and what you think, what happens in your head, will impact how you feel. And we do have some agency over this. Thereby, we have some impact on how we feel about ourselves. Okay, so we've looked at these self-stigmatizing thoughts. We've looked at the thought errors that might be happening in them. Let's do some reframing. So one self-stigmatizing thought, I'm unreliable. A reframe that's more true, more helpful, more self-compassionate, and sees nuance might be, sometimes I'm able to keep commitments, and sometimes I struggle, but I always try my best. You see the difference in feeling that that gives? If you're saying, I'm unreliable, I'm unreliable, I'm unreliable, feel terrible about yourself, right? And you're not going to try and do new things. If you're saying to yourself, sometimes I'm able to keep commitments, sometimes I struggle, but I always try my best, that totally changes your self-view. That totally changes your self-concept. Another one, I can't handle anything. That's a self-stigmatizing thought. I have bipolar, I can't handle anything. A way to reframe that might be, I have overcome many obstacles. Another way might be, sometimes I have to work harder than others to regulate my reactions. Okay, so there's a couple of ways we could reframe this. Let's do two more reframes. People often say, if they have bipolar, I'm difficult to love. I'm difficult to love. Hold on a second. A nice reframe for that might be, I have strengths and weaknesses just like anyone else, and I am worthy of love the way I am. I hope you can feel the difference in how those resonate with you personally. And one last one, I will never get better. These are the ones I hear a lot. I have bipolar, I will never get better. And a reframe might be, I may have long-term struggles, but things are always changing. I don't know the future. So one more slide where we see a couple of these in writing that I think might help. Oh, this is a great quote that one of my participants said. Living with self-stigma is like driving with the brake on. It makes everything harder. So here are a review of working with your self-stigmatizing thoughts, examining them, identifying thought errors like catastrophizing, etc., reframing your thoughts, make them more true, more helpful, be non-judgmental, show self-compassion, account for nuance. These are all very powerful choices you can make. And then we have some reframes. I'll never amount to anything. My condition may change the course of my life, but there's plenty I can do and accomplish. Or if you're thinking I am unreliable, a reframe might be, sometimes I'm able to keep commitments and sometimes I struggle, but I always try my best. So again, if you're feeling bad, think about whether you're having a self-stigmatizing thought. If you can change the thought, you can impact the feeling. One thing that can also be problematic if you're experiencing self-stigma is disclosure, right? That's sharing about your bipolar. And there are a few things I want you to consider with that. The struggle with disclosure and sharing, that is both an outcome of and a contributor to stigma, right? If there were no stigma, if there were no negative beliefs about people with bipolar, if there were no negative beliefs about ourselves with bipolar, we'd probably go around talking about bipolar like as arthritis. Oh yeah, it's my arthritis medication. Oh yeah, that bothers my arthritis. I don't want to do that. But we don't, because there's so much stigma around bipolar and there's not around arthritis, right? If you're thinking about talking about your bipolar disorder, there are 3 key questions I want you to consider. If you want to talk about it, with whom you want to talk about it, and what you want to say about it. So the first one, if. Disclosure, sharing with someone, should always serve you. What do you stand to gain? If you feel pressured into sharing or you feel obligated to share, that might not be the right situation for you. If you're considering it, think about what you stand to gain. Weigh the pros and the cons, and know that not all pros and cons are weighted equally, right? So the ability to receive accommodation might be a really heavy pro, and the con of, your snarky coworker or your snarky daughter finding out or something, that might be a less heavily weighted con. So not all pros and cons are weighted equally. With whom to share is the second question. So there are certain characteristics of people that I think in general just mean they're probably better recipients of this information and more deserving of hearing our stories. If people are understanding and kind and non-judgmental, right? The opposite would be if people are racist, they're mean, they're hurtful, things like that. You get a good gut feeling about who a person is and whether or not they deserve to hear your story. And the last one is what to share. So every disclosure is different, right? There's what I call a disclosure spectrum. Not everyone will be suited to hear the same version of your story of what you want to tell. You might tell one person, I have a mental health condition, but not say what it is. You might tell someone, I have a mood disorder, but not say that it's bipolar. You might tell someone you have bipolar, but not tell them any of your experiences. You might tell someone some of your experiences, but not other experiences. So there's a whole spectrum here of what you can share with people. And it's always your choice and it's always in your control. One more slide on that. So talking about bipolar disclosure, remember there's the spectrum. Think about if, with whom, and what, and how to share. How to share if you want to share in person, if you want to share by email, whatever it is. But when you're sharing, remember, you want to educate the person. You want to craft your story because it is your story and that's very dear to you. Craft it carefully and craft it in advance. Know your highlights, what you want to talk about, and your limits, what you don't want to talk about. And most importantly, highlight hope and resilience, because look at all of us. We are living testimonies to lives that are meaningful and well-lived with bipolar, and people don't often know that's possible. So it's really important to highlight hope and resilience when you share your story with people. This is a really brief overview. If you do want to learn more about self-stigma, there's some resources on my website. You can sign up for the mailing list, which, by the way, I won't use until the workbook comes out and I mail everybody about the workbook. But maybe someone could throw it in the chat. It's ossibd.com. And yeah, so we've talked about ways to overcome self-stigma. A word about battling stigma itself, public stigma. One way to do that is to educate people, is to tell your story. You have a stigma busting superpower in your story. So when you share with someone, you're an example of what bipolar really is, right? So if you're comfortable, be open about your diagnosis so people can learn the truth. Every person you talk to, you become a new data point for them as to what bipolar actually looks like and how it actually works. So whether that's formally or informally, that's something you can do to dispel stigma. And by battling public stigma, you ultimately reduce it and thereby reduce how much self-stigma you and the rest of the community suffers from. So lastly, I'm not I am very clearly not here to whitewash and tell you, hey, it's great to have bipolar. I think we all know that's not true. The struggle is real, but if you are living with this condition, I just hope you can take a couple of moments to be proud of yourself, who you are, how far you've come, everything you've managed to accomplish in your life, even with this condition. And just remember that you are so much more than this diagnosis. So thank you.